an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Behind a marble column, at the edge of the Ashworth ballroom, Cecily Wren watched 500 candles blaze as Lady Harriet descended the staircase in a gown of ivory silk embroidered with night-blooming jasmine. The room fell silent, then erupted in whispers of admiration. Cecily's hands trembled against her plain cotton skirt, her chest tight with a pride so fierce it felt like grief, because no one in that glittering crowd knew her name. She had poured 6 weeks of her father's genius and her own sleepless nights into that masterpiece, and she would be forgotten before the last waltz ended. Then across the sea of silk and diamonds, the Duke of Hartfield's eyes found hers. He set down his glass, crossed the ballroom floor through 100 curious stairs, and stopped 3 feet from the servants' corridor, where no duke should ever stand. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "You made that." It was not a question. The Ashworth estate blazed like a constellation fallen to earth. Every window of the great house glowed amber in the September dusk, and the long drive was choked with carriages disgorging London's finest families in clouds of perfume and rustling taffeta. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into something out of legend. 500 beeswax candles burned in crystal chandeliers. White roses climbed silk-draped columns. An orchestra tuned behind a screen of potted orange trees, their fragrance mingling with the scent of champagne and expensive powder. Lady Harriet Ashworth's debut ball had been planned for a year. Her brother, Edward, Duke of Hartfield, had spared no expense. The guest list included 3 earls, a viscount, 2 members of Parliament, and half the marriageable sons of the peerage. Everything had been arranged to announce that the Ashworth family, ancient and powerful, was ready to present its jewel to society. But the true jewel of the evening was the gown. Cecily had finished the final stitches at dawn that morning. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned. She had slept perhaps 10 hours in the last 6 days. But when the housemaid carried the gown upstairs on its padded hanger, wrapped in muslin, like a sacred relic, Cecily had allowed herself one moment of satisfaction so complete it felt like pain. Ivory silk, hand-embroidered botanicals in silk thread, so fine it caught the light like spiderweb. Night-blooming jasmine twined up the bodice and spilled across the skirt in a design that looked effortless, but had required 2 weeks of careful planning and another 2 of execution. The neckline was modest but elegant. The waist sat exactly where it should. The skirt moved like water. It was the finest thing Cecily had ever made, perhaps the finest thing she would ever make. And now, at 8:30, as the first strains of a minuet drifted through the house, she stood behind a marble column near the servants' corridor and watched her creation descend the staircase on someone else's body. Lady Harriet was lovely, barely 18, with dark curls and her brother's steady gray eyes. She moved with the careful grace of a girl who had been taught how to enter a room. But it was the gown that stopped conversation. Cecily saw it happen in real time. The rustle of fans pausing, heads turning, a wave of silence rippling outward from the base of the stairs as Harriet stepped into the candlelight, and the jasmine embroidery seemed to glow. Then the whispers began. Exquisite. Where on earth did she find such a design? I have never seen work like that. Cecily's throat tightened. She pressed her spine against the cool marble and willed herself invisible. She was not a guest. She had no place in this room. Her presence was tolerated only because the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, had taken pity and allowed her to watch from the shadows. Her own dress was plain gray cotton, high-necked and severe, the kind a governess might wear. Her hands bore the faint scars of needle pricks and the calluses of her trade. She belonged to a different world entirely. But for this one moment, she let herself feel it. Pride, fierce and bright and aching. She had made that. Her mind, her hands, her father's training. Every stitch was hers. You made that. The voice came from her left, low and quiet, and far too close. Cecily's head snapped around. The Duke of Hartfield stood 3 feet away, one hand resting against the column, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black evening clothes that fit him like they had been made by someone who understood the architecture of a man's body. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it were not so carefully controlled. He looked like a man who had learned young not to let anything show. Cecily straightened. Your Grace, you made that gown, he said again. Not a question, a statement. She hesitated. It was dangerous to claim credit. Dangerous to be noticed. But she had spent 6 weeks pouring her soul into silk and thread, and she would not lie about it. Yes. His gaze moved from her face to the ballroom, where Harriet was now surrounded by admirers. And then back. It is extraordinary. Cecily felt something twist in her chest. She had heard praise before. Polite murmurs from Lady Ashworth. Appreciation from the housekeeper. But this was different. He was looking at her like she had done something that mattered. I know, she said. His brows rose slightly. The faintest suggestion of surprise. Most women in her position would have demurred, would have said something modest and self-effacing. Thank you, Your Grace. You are too kind. I only did my best. Cecily had watched her father die believing that talent spoke for itself. She would not make the same mistake. My father was a master tailor, she continued, meeting his eyes. He trained me from the time I could hold a needle. That gown represents 15 years of apprenticeship and 6 weeks of work I am proud of. So yes, it is extraordinary. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated. What is your name? Cecily Wren. Miss Wren. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt surreal in this context. A duke, acknowledging a seamstress, in the middle of his sister's debut ball. I am glad my sister had the good sense to hire you. Your sister did not hire me, Cecily said. Your housekeeper did. 6 months ago, I work from the East Wing. The East Wing, he repeated slowly. The converted linen room, she clarified. It has good light. Something flickered across his face. She could not name it. Before she could try, a voice cut through the moment, like a blade. Edward. A woman appeared at his elbow. Tall, elegant, dressed in deep blue silk with sapphires at her throat. Her blonde hair was arranged in perfect curls. Her smile was polite and practiced. Lady Caroline Fairfax. Cecily recognized her from the formal dinner 3 nights prior, when Cecily had been summoned to adjust the hem of Lady Ashworth's gown, and had passed the dining room, on her way back to the workroom. Lady Caroline's gaze flicked to Cecily, registered her presence with the barest flicker of distaste, and dismissed her entirely. They are calling for the first waltz, Caroline said, resting her gloved hand on Edward's arm with the ease of long familiarity. You promised it to me. Edward's expression smoothed into something unreadable. Of course. He glanced back at Cecily. Their eyes met for one brief, charged moment. Then he turned and allowed himself to be led back into the light and music and glittering crowd, where he belonged. Cecily watched him go. Her heart was beating too fast. Her hands were trembling again. She slipped back through the servants' corridor, past the kitchens where the staff was preparing the midnight supper, and climbed the narrow stairs to the East Wing. The converted linen room was dark and quiet. Bolts of fabric leaned against the walls. A half-finished bodice hung on the dressmaker's form. Her workbench was scattered with thread, shears, pins. She lit a single candle and sat down. Her fingers found the cuff of her sleeve. There, stitched in silk thread so fine it was nearly invisible, was a tiny sprig of jasmine, the same design as the gown. Her signature, hidden where no one would ever see it, except he had seen it. Somehow, he had known. Cecily pressed her palm against the cool wood of the workbench and let herself breathe. Downstairs, the music swelled. The ball would go on until dawn. Lady Harriet would dance with a dozen young men. The gown would be admired and envied, and copied by modistes across London. And tomorrow, Cecily would go back to being invisible. The morning after the ball, Edward Ashworth stood in the doorway of the converted linen room and told himself he had a reason to be there. He needed to thank Miss Wren personally for her work on Harriet's gown. It was a matter of courtesy, of proper management. His sister's debut had been a triumph, and the seamstress deserved acknowledgement. That was all. The room was smaller than he had imagined, narrow, with a single tall window that let in a shaft of late morning light. Bolts of fabric were stacked against one wall in a rainbow of colors. A dressmaker's form stood near the window, draped in unfinished silk. The workbench was organized with military precision. Shears, pins, spools of thread arranged by shade. A wooden box that looked like it had been built by hand. Cecily Wren sat at the bench with her back to the door, bent over a length of pale green fabric. She was sewing something by hand, her needle moving with quick, practiced efficiency. She wore the same gray dress as last night, her dark hair pinned back in a simple knot. No jewelry, no ornamentation. She did not look up. "If you have come to commission something, Your Grace, you will need to speak with Mrs. Dalton first," she said without turning. "I do not take private commissions without the housekeeper's approval." Edward blinked. "How did you know it was me?" "Your boot heels." She tied off a thread and snipped it cleanly. "The staff wears soft soles. Guests wear leather. Yours are custom. I can hear the difference." She set down the fabric, turned on her stool, and looked at him with the same direct, unsettling gaze as the night before. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" He had prepared a speech, something polite and appropriately distant, but standing in this small, sun-filled room with her eyes on him, the words felt hollow. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for the gown. Harriet has received 7 invitations this morning, 3 to dinners, 4 to garden parties, 1 from the Countess of Marlowe, who has not spoken to our family in 5 years. Cecily's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. The gown did its job then. It did more than that. He stepped into the room, careful not to disturb the organized chaos. It was art. It was silk and thread. It was both. She studied him for a long moment. Then she stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. She was shorter than he had realized. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder, but there was nothing diminutive about the way she held herself. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I appreciate the courtesy, but you do not need to come to the East Wing to thank the seamstress. A message through Mrs. Dalton would have sufficed." "I am aware." "Then why are you here?" The question hung in the air between them. Edward did not have an answer, or rather he had several, and none of them were appropriate to speak aloud, because last night, when he had looked across the ballroom and seen her standing in the shadows, watching her work move through the crowd, he had felt something shift in his chest, because she had looked at him and said "I know" with such quiet certainty that it had taken his breath away, because he had spent the last 12 hours thinking about a woman he had no business thinking about, and he did not understand why. "I wanted to see where you work," he said finally. "Why?" "Because the gown you made came from this room. I wanted to understand how." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she crossed to the workbench and picked up a small wooden box. She opened it and held it out. Inside were dozens of spools of thread, silk, cotton, linen, every shade imaginable. "My father collected these over 30 years, she said. "Some he bought, some he traded for. Some were gifts from other tailors who respected his work. When he died, this box and his shears were the only things of value he owned." Edward looked at the threads, then at her face. "He was a master tailor," Cecily continued, "the finest in 3 counties. He made coats for men who would not invite him to dinner, gowns for women who did not know his name. He died with 6 shillings to his name and 3 people at his funeral." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "Talent without patronage means nothing, Your Grace. I learned that watching him. So when you ask why I said, I know when you called the gown extraordinary, it is because I will not pretend modesty about the one thing I have that cannot be taken from me." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Not pity, something sharper. "Your father taught you well. He taught me everything." She closed the box and set it back on the bench. "And then he taught me what happens when the world does not care." Before Edward could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Both of them turned. Mrs. Dalton appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. The Earl of Norbury has arrived. He is waiting in the drawing room." Edward's jaw tightened. "I was not expecting him until this afternoon. He said the matter was urgent." Edward glanced back at Cecily. She had already turned away, picking up her needle and fabric, as if he had never been there. "Thank you, Miss Wren," he said quietly. She did not look up. "Your Grace." He left the room and followed Mrs. Dalton down the corridor. But his mind remained in the converted linen room with its single window and its carefully organized threads. The Earl of Norbury was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from marble. He stood near the drawing-room fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, radiating the particular arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Lady Caroline sat on the sofa near the window, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She looked up when Edward entered and offered a small, polite smile. "Edward," the Earl said, Forgive the early arrival. I wanted to speak with you before the household became too busy. Edward closed the door. Of course. What is the matter? The Earl's gaze flicked to Caroline, then back. I have spoken with Mr. Alderton. He believes it is time to finalize the engagement terms. Edward went very still. We agreed to wait until after Harriet's season. That was before last night's success. The Earl said smoothly, Your sister's debut has exceeded all expectations. The family's position is stronger than it has been in years. There is no reason to delay. Edward's hands curled into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax. The estate finances are not yet settled, he said carefully. There are debts that must be addressed before I can. The debts will be addressed through the marriage settlement. The Earl interrupted. That is the entire point, Edward. The Fairfax fortune secures the estate. The tenants are protected. Your father's wishes are honored. All that remains is your signature. Your father's wishes. The words hit like a blade between the ribs. Edward's father had died 2 years ago in this house, in the upstairs bedroom that Edward could not bring himself to enter. On the last night, his father had gripped Edward's wrist with surprising strength and rasped 4 words. Secure the estate, Edward. The next morning, Mr. Alderton, the family solicitor, had arrived with documents. The estate was in debt. The tenants' livelihoods were at risk. The solution, Alderton explained, was a marriage alliance with the Fairfax family. Lady Caroline's dowry would settle the debts and ensure the estate's survival for another generation. It was duty. It was necessity. It was what his father had wanted. Edward had given his word. I have not forgotten my obligations, Edward said quietly. I am glad to hear it. The Earl's smile did not reach his eyes. Then we may proceed. Caroline rose from the sofa and crossed to Edward's side. She rested her hand lightly on his arm, the same gesture she had used last night. I know this is not easy, she said softly, but it is the right thing for both our families. Edward looked down at her. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be. He felt nothing. I will speak with Alderton, he said. The Earl inclined his head. Excellent. I will remain at the estate for the week. We can finalize the details before I return to London. He turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Caroline lingered. She looked up at Edward with something that might have been sympathy. You are a good man, Edward, she said. Your father would be proud. She followed her father out, leaving Edward alone in the drawing room with the weight of a promise he could not break and did not want to keep. That evening, Edward found himself in the library. It was his favorite room in the house. 2 stories of books, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and tall windows that overlooked the gardens. He had come here as a boy to hide from tutors, as a young man to escape the endless social obligations his mother orchestrated. Now as Duke, he came here when he needed to think. He was not thinking clearly. He poured himself a brandy and stood at the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. A sound made him turn. Cecily Wren stood in the doorway, a book tucked under her arm. She froze when she saw him. Forgive me, Your Grace, she said quickly. Mrs. Dalton said I might borrow from the library. I did not realize you were here. You are welcome to stay, Edward said. She hesitated. Then she crossed to one of the shelves and began scanning the spines with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Edward watched her. She moved through the room like she belonged there, her fingers trailing along the leather-bound volumes with something close to reverence. What are you looking for? He asked. A book on botanical illustration, she said without looking at him. I am designing a gown with ferns. I want the detail to be accurate. You study botany. I study anything that helps me work. She pulled a volume from the shelf and opened it, flipping through pages of detailed engravings. My father used to say that a tailor who only knows fabric will only ever make clothes. A tailor who knows the world makes art. Edward set down his glass. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was. She closed the book and looked at Edward directly. He was also a fool. How so? He believed his work would speak for itself. That talent and integrity were enough. Her voice was quiet, but edged with something sharp. They are not. He died poor and forgotten, and I will not make the same mistake. What mistake is that? Waiting to be seen. The words hung in the air between them. Edward felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he did not want to name. And how do you intend to be seen, Miss Wren? She met his gaze. By making things so beautiful, they cannot be ignored. Before he could respond, the door opened. Lady Ashworth swept in, followed by Harriet, both dressed for dinner. "Edward, there you are," his mother said. "We are waiting for you in the dining room." The Earl and Lady Caroline are already seated. Her gaze flicked to Cecily, registered her presence with the same polite dismissal as Caroline had used, and returned to Edward. "Miss Wren," she said coolly, "the library is not a workroom." Cecily dipped her head. "Of course, my lady. Forgive me." She crossed to the door, the book still under her arm. As she passed Edward, their eyes met for the briefest moment. Then she was gone. Edward followed his mother and sister to the dining room, where the Earl and Caroline were waiting, and took his seat at the head of the table. The meal was formal, polite, suffocating. The Earl spoke of the engagement timeline. Caroline smiled. Harriet chattered about the invitations still arriving. Edward's mother presided over it all with the satisfaction of a woman who believed everything was going according to plan. Edward shifted his chair slightly to the left. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it blocked the Earl's sightline to the corridor beyond the dining room, where Cecily would have to pass on her way back to the East Wing. Caroline noticed. Her gaze flicked to Edward's chair, then to his face. She said nothing, but she knew. The commission was extended 3 days later. Harriet's debut had been such a success that Lady Ashworth decided a full season's wardrobe was required. Morning gowns, afternoon dresses, evening wear, walking costumes, riding habits, at least 24 pieces, each one requiring the same level of detail and craftsmanship as the debut gown. Mrs. Dalton delivered the news to Cecily in the workroom with an apologetic smile. "It will be at least 3 months of work, Miss Wren, possibly 4. Lady Ashworth has requested that you remain at the estate for the duration." Cecily's hands stilled on the fabric she was cutting. 3 months, 4 months, an entire season. "I understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Dalton hesitated. "There is one complication. The Earl of Norbury has expressed concern about your continued presence in the house. He believes it is inappropriate for a tradesperson to reside in the family wing." Cecily's jaw tightened. "I work from the East Wing, Mrs. Dalton. I have never entered the family quarters without permission. I know, but the Earl has influence. If he insists, he will not." The voice came from the doorway. Both women turned. Edward stood in the corridor, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace," Mrs. Dalton said, startled. Edward stepped into the room. His gaze moved from the housekeeper to Cecily, then back. "Miss Wren's work requires proximity to the household," he said. "The East Wing is appropriate. If the Earl has concerns, he may bring them to me directly." Mrs. Dalton's eyes widened slightly. "Of course, Your Grace." She curtsied and left the room, closing the door behind her. Cecily set down her shears. "You did not need to do that. The Earl does not dictate who works in this house," Edward said. "I do. And yet you are engaged to his daughter." The words came out sharper than she intended. Edward's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Not yet," he said quietly. Cecily looked at him, really looked at him. He stood in the doorway of her workroom like a man who did not know whether to stay or leave, his hands at his sides, his shoulders tense. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" she asked. "I wanted to make sure the Earl's objections would not interfere with your work. That is not why you are here." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he crossed to the workbench and picked up a spool of thread, dark green silk. He turned it over in his hands, his thumb brushing the smooth surface. "My father told me that duty was the only thing that mattered," he said. "That sentiment was a luxury men like us could not afford. I have spent my entire life believing that." He set the spool down and looked at her. "And then I met a woman who looks at the world and says I know, and I do not understand why I cannot stop thinking about it." Cecily's breath caught. "You should stop thinking about it," she said quietly. "I am aware. You are engaged, or you will be, to a woman whose father has the power to destroy this estate, and everyone who depends on it. I am aware of that as well. Then what do you want from me?" The question hung between them, raw and dangerous. Edward's gaze held hers. "I do not know." Cecily felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite breaking, but close. "You should go, Your Grace," she said. "Before someone notices, you are here." He nodded slowly, but he did not move. "The work requires proximity," he said finally. That is what I told Mrs. Dalton. It was not entirely a lie. He turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Cecily stood alone in the workroom, her hands trembling, and wondered how long she could survive in a house where the one person who truly saw her was the one person she could never have. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt both inevitable and impossible. Edward found reasons to visit the workroom, always with a pretext. A question about Harriet's wardrobe, a request to see fabric samples, a message from his mother. Cecily never questioned it. She answered his questions, showed him her work, spoke to him with the same directness she used with everyone. But the air between them grew heavier with each encounter. One afternoon, he noticed the embroidery on her cuff, a tiny sprig of jasmine, stitched in thread so fine it was almost invisible. "You signed it," he said. She glanced down. "I sign everything I make, just not where anyone can see." He reached out, his fingertips brushing the fabric. The touch was brief, barely there, but she felt it like a brand. She pulled her arm back, not quickly, but deliberately. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "you should not be here." "I know. Then why do you keep coming back?" He looked at her with an expression she could not name. "Because this is the only room in the house where I do not have to pretend." The words broke something open inside her. She wanted to tell him to leave, to stop looking at her like she was something he could not have, to remember his duty and his promise, and the 200 families who depended on him making the right choice. But she did not, because she understood what he meant. This room, with its bolts of fabric, and its single window, and its carefully organized threads, was the only place where she did not have to be invisible. And he was the only person who had ever walked into it and seen her. The household dinner, 3 nights later, was a study in controlled tension. The Earl sat at Edward's right, expounding on estate management with the confidence of a man who believed his opinions were facts. Lady Caroline sat across from him, serene and beautiful, her conversation polite and perfectly calibrated. Harriet chattered about the upcoming garden party at the Marlowe estate. Lady Ashworth presided with satisfaction. Edward sat at the head of the table and felt like he was drowning. Halfway through the second course, the Earl's gaze drifted toward the corridor beyond the dining room. "I understand the seamstress is still in residence," he said casually. Lady Ashworth nodded. "Miss Wren. She is completing Harriet's wardrobe." "A tradesperson living in the house for months," the Earl said. "It sets an unusual precedent." "She works from the East Wing," Edward said. "She does not intrude on the household." Still, the Earl's smile was thin. One wonders if such proximity is entirely appropriate. Edward set down his fork, very carefully. Then he shifted his chair, just slightly, just enough. The movement blocked the Earl's sight line to the corridor, where Cecily would pass on her way to the kitchens. The Earl's eyes narrowed. Caroline's gaze flicked from her father to Edward. She said nothing, but her expression was unreadable. "Miss Wren's work is exemplary," Edward said quietly. "Her presence is a credit to this house." The Earl's jaw tightened. "Of course, Your Grace." The meal continued, but the tension did not dissipate. Later, when the ladies had retired, and the men remained at the table with port, the Earl leaned back in his chair and studied Edward with cold calculation. "You are playing a dangerous game, Edward." Edward met his gaze. "I do not know what you mean." "Do you not?" The Earl's voice was soft. "Lethal. You have given your word. The engagement will be announced. The estate will be secured. If you jeopardize that for a passing fascination with a seamstress, you will destroy everything your father built." Edward's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "I have not forgotten my obligations," he said. "See that you do not." The Earl rose and left the room. Edward sat alone at the table, staring at the dregs of his port, and felt the cage close tighter around him. Late that night, unable to sleep, Edward returned to the library. He found old Jennings there, his father's retired valet, sitting by the fire with a book. Jennings had served the family for 40 years before retiring to a cottage on the estate. He still visited the house occasionally, more out of habit than necessity. "Your Grace," Jennings said, rising. "Sit, please," Edward said. "I did not mean to disturb you." Jennings settled back into his chair. Edward poured himself a brandy and stood at the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. "You look troubled, my lord," Jennings said quietly. Edward let out a slow breath. "Do you remember my father's last night?" "I do. What did he say?" "Exactly." Jennings frowned. He said, "Secure the estate. Be stronger than sentiment." Edward turned. "Did he mention Lady Caroline?" Jennings hesitated. "No, my lord. He did not." "Did he mention the Fairfax family at all?" Jennings's expression grew troubled. He spoke only of the estate. "Mr. Alderton arrived the next morning with the marriage terms. I assumed that my father had discussed it with him beforehand." "Yes." Edward set down his glass. His hands were shaking. "What if he had not?" Edward said quietly. Jennings stared at him. "My lord, what if the promise was never about marrying Lady Caroline? What if it was only about securing the estate?" And Alderton reframed it afterward. The silence that followed was deafening. "That would be a grave accusation, Your Grace," Jennings said slowly. "I know, but if it were true..." Jennings trailed off, his expression stricken. "If it were true, then you have been honoring a lie." Edward closed his eyes. A lie. The cage that had bound him for 2 years might never have been locked at all. And if that were true, then every day he had spent preparing to marry Caroline, every moment he had told himself he had no choice, had been a choice, the choice to stay safe, to avoid the terrifying freedom of deciding for himself. He opened his eyes and looked at Jennings. "Do not speak of this to anyone," he said. "Of course, my lord." Edward left the library and climbed the stairs to his room, but he did not sleep. He lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, and felt the foundations of his entire life begin to crack. The discovery came 2 weeks later, entirely by accident. Edward had been searching his father's study for estate documents when he found the correspondence tucked into the back of a drawer. Letters between Mr. Alderton and the Earl of Norbury, dated 6 months before his father's death. He read them twice, then a third time. The marriage terms had been drafted before his father died. The financial arrangements, the timeline, the specific clauses tying the Fairfax dowry to the estate's debts, all of it written before the deathbed scene, all of it signed by Alderton and the Earl. Edward's father's signature was nowhere on the documents. Edward sat at the desk, the letters spread before him, and felt the cage shatter. His father had never promised him to Caroline. Alderton had manufactured the match to serve the Earl's financial interests. The sacred duty that had governed Edward's life for 2 years was a fiction built by men who stood to profit from it. He had been lied to, and he had believed it because believing was easier than choosing. Edward's hands shook as he folded the letters and locked them in the desk drawer. He did not know what to do with this knowledge. Did not know how to dismantle a promise that had never been real without destroying everything around it. But he knew one thing. He could not marry Caroline. Not now. Not ever. The Earl announced the engagement date at dinner 3 nights later. "The 20th of next month," he said, raising his glass. "A spring wedding. The banns will be read starting Sunday." Lady Ashworth beamed. Harriet clapped her hands. Caroline smiled serenely. Edward sat frozen at the head of the table, the letters burning in his mind. "Edward," his mother prompted. He forced himself to lift his glass. "To the 20th. The words tasted like ash. After dinner, the Earl cornered him in the corridor. "I trust there will be no further delays," the Earl said quietly. Edward met his gaze. "No good." The Earl's smile was cold. "I would hate for anything to jeopardize this arrangement. It would be unfortunate if certain debts were called in prematurely, or if your sister's seamstress lost her brother's apprenticeship bond." Edward went very still. "What did you say?" "Young Daniel Wren, apprentice to a printer in the village. The bond is co-signed by your steward, is it not? It would be a shame if that arrangement were to dissolve. The boy would lose his position. His sister would lose her income. One wonders what would become of them." The threat was clear. Edward's vision blurred with rage. "You would destroy a boy's future to ensure my compliance. I would do what is necessary to protect my daughter's interests," the Earl said, "as I trust you will do what is necessary to protect yours." He walked away, leaving Edward standing alone in the corridor. His hands clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. Cecily was packing when Edward found her. The workroom was half dismantled, bolts of fabric wrapped in muslin, her tools organized in their wooden box. The dressmaker's form stood bare near the window. She looked up when he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, what are you doing?" "The Earl's steward delivered a message this morning. My commission is complete. I am to vacate the east wing by week's end. Edward's chest tightened. Harriet's wardrobe is not finished. Lady Ashworth has hired a modiste from London to complete it. Cecily folded a length of silk with precise, controlled movements. I am no longer needed. That is not true, is it not? She looked at him directly. The engagement is announced. The wedding date is set. My presence here is an inconvenience. The Earl has made that clear. Edward crossed the room. Cecily, do not. Her voice was quiet, but edged with steel. Do not come here and tell me. This is not what you want. You have had weeks to act. Weeks to say something. Anything. And you have chosen silence. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. She set down the silk and faced him. You are the Duke of Hartfield. You have more power than anyone I have ever known, and you are using it to do nothing. If I break this engagement, the Earl will destroy your brother's apprenticeship. Cecily froze. What? He threatened it this evening. If I do not marry Caroline, Daniel loses his bond. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she let out a slow, shaking breath. So that is the cage, she said quietly. Not duty, not honor, fear. Edward flinched. I am trying to protect you, he said. I do not need your protection, Cecily said. I need you to choose, but you will not. Because choosing is terrifying, and staying silent is safe. She turned back to her packing. Edward stood in the middle of the workroom, the words burning in his throat, and could not speak them. He left without saying goodbye. The rain began 2 days later. A summer storm that rolled in from the coast, turning the sky iron gray, and the gardens into rivers of mud. Thunder rumbled. Lightning split the sky. Edward was crossing the garden when the downpour started. He broke into a run, heading for the house, but a voice stopped him. Your Grace. He turned. Cecily stood near the garden folly, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. She must have been caught in the storm, the same as him. Miss Wren, he said, come inside. You will catch your death. I am already soaked, she said. A few more minutes will not matter. He crossed to the folly. It was a small stone structure, open on 3 sides, built decades ago, as a picturesque ruin. Inside it was dry, barely. Cecily stepped under the roof, shivering. Her gray dress clung to her, dark with rain. Her hands were trembling. Edward removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders. His hands remained on the lapels. She looked up at him. Their faces were inches apart. The rain was loud around them, a curtain of sound that made the rest of the world disappear. You should go, she said quietly. I know, you are engaged, I know. Then, why are you still standing here? Because he could not make himself let go. Because the feel of the coat under his hands and the warmth of her beneath it was the only real thing he had felt in weeks. Because he was terrified. I do not know, he said. Cecily's gaze searched his face. Then she reached up and gently pulled his hands away. You are kind to me in private and silent in public, she said. That is not love, Your Grace. That is convenience. She stepped out from under the coat and walked into the rain. Edward stood alone in the folly, his coat in his hands, and watched her disappear into the storm. That evening, Cecily came to the terrace. Edward was standing at the stone balustrade, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. He heard her footsteps and turned. She stood in the doorway, dry now, dressed in a simple blue dress he had never seen before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked like someone preparing to leave. I am going to Bath, she said without preamble. Edward's heart stopped. When? Tomorrow morning. I have hired a carriage. I have saved enough from my commissions to rent a small shop. I will take private clients, build my own reputation. What about Daniel? I will bring him with me. The Earl cannot touch an apprenticeship bond in another county. Edward stared at her. You have planned this. I have planned this since the day I arrived, she said. I will not wait for powerful men to decide my future. She crossed to where he stood. The rain was beginning again, soft and steady. I came to say goodbye, she said, and to tell you something. What? I see what is in your eyes when you look at me, she said quietly. I see the same thing I feel when I look at you. But seeing is not enough. Feeling is not enough. She took a step closer. Ask me before someone else does. Edward froze. The words hit him like a lightning strike. She was not pleading. She was not begging. She was offering him a chance. One chance. He reached out and caught her wrist. Then I am asking, he said, his voice rough. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Asking in the rain is easy, she said. Ask me where it costs you something. She pulled free, gently, firmly. Then she turned and walked back into the house, leaving him standing alone on the terrace. As the rain fell harder, Edward gripped the balustrade and felt the last piece of the cage shatter. She was right. She had always been right. Asking in the rain cost him nothing. It was a moment, a feeling, a wish. Asking where it mattered, where it would destroy the engagement and defy the Earl and risk everything he had been taught to protect. That was the choice she was demanding. And he finally understood. Real strength was not enduring the cage. It was choosing to leave it. The drawing room the next morning was filled with cold sunlight. The Earl sat near the fireplace, his expression smug. Lady Caroline sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Alderton stood near the desk, the engagement papers spread before him. Edward's mother and Harriet sat on the sofa, watching with polite anticipation. Edward stood at the window, his back to the room, and felt the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. Edward, the Earl said, the papers are ready. All that remains is your signature. Edward turned. He crossed to the desk and looked down at the documents. The terms were clear. The dowry, the debts, the timeline. Everything his father had supposedly wanted, except his father had never wanted it. Edward picked up the pen. Then he set it down. Mr. Alderton, he said quietly, were you present at my father's deathbed? Alderton blinked. I was not, Your Grace. I arrived the following morning. And yet you drafted these terms the night he died. Alderton's expression flickered. The terms were discussed beforehand. Your Grace, your father made his wishes clear. Did he? Edward reached into his coat and pulled out the letters he had found. He placed them on the desk. These are dated 6 months before my father's death. They outline the marriage terms in full, signed by you and the Earl. My father's signature is absent. The room went silent. The Earl's face darkened. What are you implying? Edward looked at him. I am not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. My father never promised me to Lady Caroline. You and Alderton manufactured that promise to serve your financial interests. Alderton stepped forward. Your Grace, I assure you, old Jennings was present at the deathbed, Edward continued. He confirmed what I have suspected. My father said, secure the estate. Be stronger than sentiment. He did not name the Fairfax family. You added that instruction afterward. He turned to Caroline. She was watching him with an unreadable expression. You deserved honesty from the beginning, Edward said. I am sorry you did not receive it. He placed the unsigned papers on the table. I will not sign a contract built on a reframing of a dying man's words. The Earl shot to his feet. You gave your word. I gave my word to honor a promise that was never made, Edward said. I will not compound that lie with a marriage neither of us wants. Caroline stood slowly. For a long moment, she looked at Edward. Then she turned to her father. He is right, she said quietly. The Earl stared at her. Caroline, I do not love him, father. I never have, and he does not love me. She looked back at Edward. I wish you had found the courage to say this months ago, but I am grateful you found it now. She walked out of the room, her head high. The Earl's face was purple with rage. You will regret this, Ashworth. I will call in every debt. I will destroy, you will do nothing, Edward said, because if you threaten this estate, or anyone under my protection, I will ensure every person in London knows that you and Alderton fabricated a deathbed promise to coerce a duke into marriage. Your reputation will not survive it. The Earl opened his mouth, closed it. Then he turned and stormed out, Alderton scrambling after him. Edward's mother sat frozen on the sofa. Harriet stared at him with wide eyes. Edward, his mother said faintly. What have you done? What I should have done 2 years ago, Edward said. He walked out of the drawing room, through the entrance hall, and out the front door into the morning light. He did not have a coat. He had left it in the drawing room. He did not care. He ran to the stables, saddled his horse, and rode. The road to Bath was muddy and rutted from the rain. Edward pushed his horse hard, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the crossroads, where the estate boundary ended, and saw the carriage. It was small, hired, pulled by 2 horses. The driver sat hunched on the box, waiting. Edward dismounted and crossed to the carriage door. It opened. Cecily looked down at him, her expression carefully blank. You left without telling me, Edward said. You had papers to sign. I did not sign them. Her eyes widened. What? I broke the arrangement. Not for the room. not for the estate. Because Jennings told me the truth, and I could not build a marriage on a lie. He stepped closer. But that is not why I am here. She stared at him. You told me to ask you before someone else did, Edward said. I was too slow. I was afraid. But I am asking now. Not because someone else will. Not because it is easy. Because I cannot imagine standing in any room that matters without you in it. Cecily's breath hitched. You left your coat, she said. I left everything. She stepped down from the carriage. Into the mud. Into the rain-soaked road that was the opposite of a ballroom. She took his face in her hands. The hands that had held the needle, that carried her father's gift, that had made beauty out of thread and silk, and she kissed him. Not in a library, not on a terrace, on a muddy road in the open air, at the edge of his world, and the beginning of hers. When they pulled apart, Edward was shaking. I do not know what happens next, he said. Neither do I, Cecily said. But we will figure it out together. She took his hand, and they stood there, on the road between two worlds, and chose each other. Weeks later, morning light filled a room in a house that was not quite grand, and not quite modest, but was entirely theirs. The blue silk dress hung in the window. The first garment Cecily had ever made for herself. Not a commission. Not for someone else's body. For hers. Edward stood near the window, tracing the embroidery with one finger. Ferns and jasmine, stitched in thread so fine it caught the light. You signed this one too, he said. Cecily watched from the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, a smile playing at her lips. This one I signed where everyone can see, she said. Edward turned. The light filled the room. Through the open door, the work table was visible, covered in bolts of fabric and spools of thread. The Earl had withdrawn his support. The London modistes whispered about scandal. Half of society refused invitations, but the other half came anyway. Because Cecily's work was extraordinary. Because talent, when paired with courage, could not be ignored. And because Edward had chosen her. Publicly, irrevocably, in a way that left no room for doubt. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her, taking her hand. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Regret what? Choosing this. Choosing me. The scandal. The closed doors. Cecily looked at him. At the man who had walked out of a drawing room and left everything behind. Who had ridden through mud and rain to find her. Who had asked her where it cost him something. I regret nothing, she said. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and certain. Outside, the world continued. The estate was being restructured, the debts addressed through revenue, not marriage. The tenants remained. The house still stood, and in a room filled with morning light and silk thread, two people who had spent their lives being told what they were worth finally understood. They were worth everything, because they had chosen to be.